Waitress is fired for paying meal to poor elderly lady. Days later, a black limousine stops at her door. What happens next will make you cry. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she tried to count the pills in her palm. The employee bathroom at Sunrise Diner offered her only moment of privacy during her morning shift. The dizzy spells were getting worse, and she couldn't afford to lose another job. "Sarah, table 6 needs you." Frank Thompson's voice boomed from outside. She swallowed 1 pill instead of the prescribed 3, tucking the rest into her pocket. Each tablet meant choosing between medication and rent. At 28, she was running out of both time and options. The morning rush at the diner blurred into a routine she could perform half-conscious. Pour coffee, take orders, smile. Regular customers, mostly elderly, filled the booths. They didn't notice how she gripped the counter for support between tables, or how her uniform hung looser each week. Between her morning shift at the diner, afternoon hours at Thompson's Pharmacy, and evening cleaning job at the local office building, Sarah barely made enough to cover her basic expenses. Medical bills piled up on her small apartment's kitchen table, each one a reminder of the autoimmune disease slowly consuming her life. A wave of dizziness hit her as she carried plates to table 4. Sarah steadied herself, breathing deeply. Dropping these plates meant losing her job, and losing her job meant no medication at all. "Are you okay, dear?" Mrs. Henderson, a regular customer, reached for her arm. "Just tired," Sarah forced a smile. "Working 3 jobs keeps me busy." The truth was far worse than being tired. Last week's doctor's appointment still echoed in her mind. Without proper treatment, you have 6 months at best. You need to start the new medication regimen immediately. She had nodded, knowing it was impossible. The new treatment cost more than her monthly income from all 3 jobs combined. Near the end of her shift, Sarah made her first serious mistake. While preparing medication for Mr. Jenkins, another regular who trusted her to sort his daily pills, her vision blurred. She almost gave him the wrong dosage before catching herself at the last moment. Frank noticed. "Second time this week you've seemed off," he warned. "One more slip-up, and we'll have to reconsider your position here." Sarah nodded, fighting back tears. The diner job paid the least, but provided the most reliable income. Without it, her careful balancing act would collapse. In the employee bathroom again, Sarah stared at her reflection. Dark circles underlined her eyes, and her face looked gaunt. The foster care system had taught her to hide pain early, but some things couldn't be hidden forever. As she changed for her next job, Sarah found the medical ultimatum in her pocket, crumpled next to her remaining pills. 6 months. Maybe less, given how quickly her symptoms were progressing. The pharmacy would be worse than the diner. 8 hours of standing, counting other people's medications, knowing she couldn't afford her own. Then, the night cleaning job, where at least no one would see her rest between tasks. Sarah grabbed her bag and stepped out into the cold morning. 3 jobs, 1 failing body, and a countdown she couldn't stop. Something had to give, and soon. She didn't know that tomorrow would bring a choice that would change everything. A choice between her own survival and an act of kindness that would cost her more than she could imagine. Margaret Wilson visited Sunrise Diner 3 times that week. Each time she ordered just water and studied the menu for long minutes. Sarah noticed her hands shaking while holding the laminated pages, her eyes showing momentary confusion. "Just water again?" Sarah asked on the 3rd day. "I'm not very hungry," Margaret answered, but her eyes lingered on the breakfast specials. Sarah recognized the signs. Working at the pharmacy had taught her to spot when elderly customers were struggling with memory issues. Margaret's clothes were clean but worn, her dignity intact despite obvious confusion. "I used to teach, you know," Margaret said suddenly. "3rd grade. The children always." She stopped, frowning, unable to complete the thought. Frank watched from behind the counter, his face darkening with each minute Margaret occupied the booth without ordering. "Either she orders or she leaves," he muttered as Sarah passed. During her bathroom break, Sarah found Margaret's purse on the sink. Inside, an ID and several expired credit cards, but no cash. She returned it to Margaret's table, pretending she hadn't looked inside. "Oh, thank you," Margaret said. I don't remember leaving it there." Sarah's own medication bottle felt heavy in her pocket. 2 pills left. Her next paycheck was a week away, and she needed to choose between rent and refills. Margaret's hands trembled as she closed her menu again. Maybe just more water. Sarah glanced at Frank, then at Margaret. The morning sun highlighted the older woman's face, reminding her of Mrs. Thompson, the only foster parent who had shown her real kindness. "I'll get you our breakfast special," Sarah said. "On the house." Margaret's eyes widened. "Oh no, I couldn't. Please, you remind me of someone who helped me once." As Sarah prepared the order, Frank stepped closer. "What do you think you're doing? I'll pay for it myself. That's against policy, you know that." Sarah served Margaret the full breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee. The older woman's hands steadied as she ate, color returning to her face. "I was so hungry," Margaret whispered. "I thought I had my wallet, but lately, things get confused." Sarah's vision blurred briefly, a reminder of her skipped medication. The money for Margaret's breakfast would have bought 2 more pills. She pushed the thought away. "Mitchell, my office, now." Frank's voice cut through the morning noise. In his office, Frank held up the receipt. "You've been here 2 years. You know we don't give free meals. I'm paying for it myself. That's stealing from the diner, affecting our inventory, our records. It's one breakfast. It's grounds for termination." Sarah felt the room spin slightly. Without this job, her careful balance would collapse. No insurance, no medication, no chance at survival. "Please," she started. "I'm calling the owner. This behavior needs to be addressed." Through the office window, Sarah watched Margaret finish her meal. For a moment, the older woman's confusion cleared and she smiled. A real smile that transformed her entire face. The choice was made. Sometimes kindness was worth any price. Sarah's hand clutched her pill bottle. 2 tablets left, no job prospects, and a medical countdown ticking in her head. Tomorrow's problems would have to wait. Today, she had given someone's mother, someone's former teacher, a moment of dignity. As Margaret left the diner, she paused at the door. "Thank you," she said clearly, a flash of her former self shining through. "Not just for the food, for seeing me." Frank's voice echoed from the office, speaking with the owner on the phone. Sarah's vision blurred again, worse this time. The morning rush continued around her, but all she could focus on was her racing heart and the knowledge that everything was about to change. She didn't regret her choice. But as her symptoms intensified and Frank's angry voice grew louder, she wondered how much that moment of kindness would ultimately cost. Frank made the firing as public as possible. He gathered the morning staff in the dining area, customers and all, to set an example. "Theft is theft," he announced, whether it's taking money from the register or giving away free food. Sarah stood by the counter, her legs shaking from another missed dose. The room spun slightly, but she forced herself to stay upright. "Clear out your locker and leave your uniform," Frank continued, "and don't expect a reference." The walk to the employee area felt endless. Behind her, whispers from customers and coworkers filled the air. Her hands trembled as she emptied her locker, her eyes nearly dropping the bottle of pills, now empty. Outside the diner, Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from her pharmacy supervisor. "Heard what happened at Sunrise. Don't bother coming in. Position filled. 2 jobs gone in 10 minutes. She tried calling her supervisor, but the call went straight to voicemail. At home, an eviction notice waited on her door. Final warning, pay in 48 hours or vacate. Sarah sat on her bed calculating numbers that wouldn't add up. Her savings could cover either 1 month's rent or 2 weeks of medication. Not both. Her phone rang, the cleaning company. "Sorry, but we heard about the incident. We can't risk our reputation." "What incident? I paid for that breakfast myself." "Frank Thompson called, said you were caught stealing. We have contracts with high-end offices. Can't take chances." The call ended. 3 jobs gone. Sarah's vision blurred, and this time it wasn't from tears. She spent the next day applying for waitress positions. Each time the response was the same. "We'll call you." She overheard one manager on the phone. "Thompson? Yeah, she's here now. Thanks for the heads up." By evening, her symptoms were getting worse. The room wouldn't stop spinning. She made it halfway through an interview at Carson's diner before collapsing. "Someone call an ambulance." "No," Sarah protested weakly. "Can't afford it." They called anyway. The emergency room was bright and cold. A doctor reviewed her chart, frowning. "Your condition's deteriorating rapidly. Why did you stop your medication?" "Lost my jobs. couldn't afford it. Without proper treatment, you're looking at organ failure within months, maybe weeks at this rate. The bill they handed her might as well have been a death sentence. 3 months' rent for 5 hours in the ER. Back home, Sarah found more messages. The pharmacy had called her references, warning them about employee theft. Her resume, built carefully over years, was worthless now. She tried calling former foster families for help. Most numbers were disconnected. Those who answered had their own problems. Times are tough, they said. Sorry. That night, fever set in. Sarah lay in her bed, calculating how long she could last without medication, without rent, without options. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Is this Sarah Mitchell? About your application? The voice paused. Sorry, just got a call from Sunrise Diner. Position's been filled. Click. In the bathroom mirror, her reflection was a stranger. Pale, shaking, defeated. The girl who'd survived foster homes, who'd worked 3 jobs while studying, who'd never asked for help. Now she couldn't even help herself. The eviction notice mocked her from the kitchen table, her medical papers scattered beside it, each one a reminder of time running out. Tomorrow, she'd try again. Tomorrow, she'd find something. Tomorrow. The room spun violently. Sarah reached for the wall but found only air. When she woke up, hospital lights blinded her. A nurse checked her vitals. Insurance? She asked. Sarah closed her eyes. This was it? Rock bottom. She didn't know that rock bottom was where her real story would begin. The Pine Street Cafe wasn't much, but they hired Sarah as a cleaner without asking questions. 6 hours a day, minimum wage, no benefits. It was something. She was mopping the floor when Eleanor Roberts first appeared. The woman sat at table 7, ordered nothing, and watched Sarah work for an hour. You missed a spot, Eleanor said as Sarah passed. There, and there. Sarah silently cleaned the already clean spots. The next day, Eleanor returned. This time she spilled her coffee. Twice. Sorry, she said, not sounding sorry at all. Clean it up, please. Sarah's hands shook as she wiped the mess. Her medication schedule was now when she could afford it, and her symptoms were getting worse. Eleanor came every day that week. Each visit brought a new challenge. A dropped plate, a complicated order, complaints about cleanliness. The manager started giving Sarah warning looks. Why do you put up with this job? Eleanor asked on Friday, watching Sarah clean another deliberate spill. No choice. There's always a choice. Sarah wanted to argue but saved her energy for staying upright. The following Tuesday, everything changed. Sarah was cleaning tables when she heard a familiar voice. I'm sure I brought my wallet. Margaret Wilson stood at the counter, confused and shaking. Sarah rushed over, forgetting her cleaning duties. Mrs. Wilson, are you okay? Margaret turned, her eyes unfocused. I was going somewhere. Ma, I can't remember. Eleanor watched from table 7, her expression unreadable. Let me help you sit down, Sarah said, leading Margaret to a booth. The manager approached, frowning. If she's not ordering, I'll buy her breakfast, Sarah interrupted, knowing it would cost her tomorrow's medication. Eleanor stood suddenly. That won't be necessary. She stopped as Margaret grabbed the table, her face going pale. Sarah recognized the signs from her pharmacy training. She's having a TIA, a mini-stroke, call 911. The room spun as Sarah's own symptoms flared, but she kept focused on Margaret. Blood pressure, breathing, response time, everything she'd learned from handling medical emergencies. Eleanor moved closer, her stern demeanor cracking. Mother? Sarah's vision blurred. She heard sirens in the distance. Stay with us, Mrs. Wilson, she urged, checking Margaret's pulse. Help is coming. The paramedics arrived quickly. As they loaded Margaret into the ambulance, Sarah's legs finally gave out. She caught herself on a chair. Eleanor noticed. You're ill. I'm fine. You're not. How long have you been skipping your medication? Sarah stared. How did you? I've been watching you all week. The tremors, the dizziness, the careful way you move. Are you following me? I've been testing you. Eleanor's voice softened. After what you did for my mother at Sunrise Diner, I needed to understand who you are. The room tilted sharply. Sarah felt herself falling. I wanted to see if your kindness was real, Eleanor said, catching her. If you'd help her again, even after losing everything. Sarah tried to focus, but the edges of her vision were going dark. You need a hospital. Eleanor's voice seemed distant. Can't afford. I'm Eleanor Roberts. Everything's about to change. Sarah heard the manager calling an ambulance. felt Eleanor supporting her weight. Why? She managed to ask. Because true kindness is rare, Eleanor answered. And my mother was right about you. The world faded to black as Sarah collapsed, not knowing she'd just passed the final test. When she woke up, her life would never be the same. Sarah woke up in a private hospital room. Her arm was connected to an IV, and her head felt clearer than it had in weeks. Eleanor Roberts sat in a chair near the bed, reading through medical charts. Your doctor says you've been playing Russian roulette with your health. I can't pay for this room. Already taken care of. Eleanor set down the charts. We need to talk about my mother. Sarah tried to sit up. Is Mrs. Wilson okay? Stable. The TIA was mild, but that's not what I mean. Eleanor pulled out an old photograph. Look familiar? The photo showed a younger Margaret in a classroom. Sarah's breath caught. Mrs. Thompson? My mother taught at Foster Haven for 15 years. She never forgot about you. Memories flooded back. 3rd grade. The teacher who packed extra lunches. Who stayed after school to help with homework. Who disappeared suddenly mid-year. She had to retire early, Eleanor explained. Early onset dementia. It's progressed since then. Sarah stared at the photo. I didn't recognize her at the diner. But you helped her anyway, twice. Cost yourself everything both times. Anyone would have. No, Eleanor interrupted. They wouldn't. We've watched it happen. People see a confused elderly woman and look away. You saw someone who needed help. A nurse entered to check Sarah's vitals. Eleanor waited until they were alone again. I'm offering you a job at the Roberts Foundation. We work with elderly care initiatives. Sarah's instinct was to refuse. I'm not qualified. You have something better than qualifications. You have compassion. The rest can be taught. I can't accept charity. This isn't charity. It's an investment. Eleanor's voice hardened. But first, you need to accept treatment. The Foundation's insurance will cover it. Sarah's hands clenched the blanket. Why are you doing this? Because my mother saw something in you 15 years ago. Because you proved her right twice without even knowing who she was. Because we need people like you. A knock at the door interrupted them. Frank Thompson stood in the doorway, his face red. This is a private floor, Eleanor said coldly. The diner's surveillance video is missing, Frank said, and rumors are spreading about Margaret Wilson being found. I know you're behind this. Mr. Thompson, Eleanor stood. I suggest you leave before I call security. You can't protect her. She's a thief. I've made sure everyone knows it. Really? Eleanor smiled without warmth. The Roberts Foundation's legal team might disagree. They're very interested in workplace discrimination cases. Frank's face paled. He backed out without another word. See? Eleanor turned to Sarah. We protect our own. Sarah's mind raced. The medication was working. Her thoughts were clear for the first time in months, but years of survival instincts screamed at her to refuse help. I need time to think. You have until discharge, tomorrow morning. Eleanor headed for the door. But remember, my mother needs people who understand, who see elderly patients as people, not problems. After Eleanor left, Sarah found a notebook in the bedside drawer. Inside was a handwritten note. Dear Sarah, I remember the little girl who stayed after school to help clean the classroom, who shared her lunch with other foster children. Some things never change. Margaret Wilson, you're Mrs. Thompson. Sarah closed the notebook. Through the window she could see the Roberts Foundation building in the distance. Sometimes help came from unexpected places. Sometimes the hardest part was learning to accept it. The choice was hers. She had until morning to decide. Sarah's first day at the Roberts Foundation started with Victoria Chen, senior director, making her position clear. Eleanor may have hired you, but you report to me, Victoria said, not looking up from her computer. Your desk is in the outer office. Start by organizing our elderly care files. The outer office was a converted storage room. Boxes of files filled every corner, some dating back 20 years. We need these digitized by Friday, Victoria added. All of them. Sarah started working through the files, her hands steady thanks to the new medication. Each folder told a story: elderly residents forgotten in nursing homes, seniors struggling with medical bills, families desperate for help. Those are confidential, Victoria snapped, appearing at the door. You don't have clearance to read them. How can I organize them without? Just scan and label, nothing more. But Sarah had already seen enough. The foundation helped hundreds of elderly residents, but thousands more were on waiting lists. Many cases looked similar to Margaret's. During lunch, Sarah ate at her desk taking notes. Patterns emerged in the files: gaps in care, repeated issues, opportunities for prevention. Eleanor found her there, still working. "Victoria said you're behind schedule," Eleanor commented. "I've been analyzing the cases," Sarah showed her notes. "We could prevent many of these crises if we intervened earlier, like in restaurants, where seniors often show first signs of—" "That's not your job," Victoria interrupted from the doorway. "Eleanor, a word?" Sarah heard their argument through the thin walls. "She's a waitress playing social worker," Victoria said. "The board won't approve any proposals from her." "Give her a chance," Eleanor replied. "She'll damage our reputation. I've worked 10 years building relationships." "And how many lives have those relationships actually saved?" Sarah focused on her work, pretending not to hear. By evening, she'd developed a basic outline for what would become the Cafe with Dignity program. The next morning, Victoria dropped a stack of grant reports on her desk. "These need to be reformatted. All 200 pages. Today." Sarah's symptoms were returning. Her medication schedule still needed adjustment, but she worked through it, finishing both the reports and more file organization. She stayed late, researching similar programs in other cities. Her desk calendar was already marked with deadlines Victoria kept adding. A cleaning crew member found her there at midnight. "You're that waitress," he said, "the one who got fired for helping the old lady." Sarah tensed. "My mom's in one of those homes," he continued. "Nobody talks to her for days sometimes. What you did, we need more people like that." His words strengthened her resolve. The next day, she arrived early to finish her proposal. Victoria was waiting. "Someone accessed confidential files from your computer last night," she said. "Care to explain?" "I was researching. You were overstepping, again." Victoria held up a printed email. "Frank Thompson sent some interesting information about your history of taking initiative without permission." Sarah's heart raced. "You've been in contact with Frank?" "The board needs to know who they're dealing with. Your background check missed some things." Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. "Victoria, my office." Sarah watched them disappear into Eleanor's office. Through the glass, she saw Victoria gesturing angrily at papers, probably her proposal draft. Her phone buzzed. A text from her doctor about adjusting her medication. The insurance paperwork was still processing. Victoria had accidentally delayed it twice. The argument in Eleanor's office grew louder. Sarah turned back to her work, adding more research to her proposal. If they wanted to fire her, they'd have to do it while she was trying to help people. A new email appeared, from Frank Thompson to Victoria, CC'd to the board. Subject: Former employee misconduct, important information. Sarah's hands shook, but not from her illness this time. The fight was just beginning. "Keep working," Eleanor said, passing by. "Victoria doesn't know what's coming." Sarah nodded, opening a new document. They wanted proof of her worth? She'd give them a program they couldn't ignore, even if it meant working twice as hard with half the support. Victoria's meeting with Frank Thompson took place at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the foundation. Sarah only knew about it because the cleaning staff overheard them and warned her. "Your information is useful," Victoria said to Frank, "but we need more. The board still supports her because of Eleanor." "I've got security footage from the diner," Frank replied, edited to show her taking money from the register. Sarah received the first anonymous email that afternoon. A video attachment showed carefully selected clips that made her look guilty. "The board meets next week," Victoria's email followed. "We should discuss your future with the foundation." Sarah forwarded everything to Eleanor, who was visiting Margaret at the hospital. No response. The next day, documents started disappearing from Sarah's computer. Program proposals, research files, contact lists, all gone. The IT department claimed it was a system glitch. "Back everything up," warned Tom, the night janitor. "Victoria had IT in your office last night." Sarah stayed late, recreating her files. A new email arrived from a nursing home director. "Your mother's been asking for you," it read. "She's very confused. Please visit." Sarah stared at the screen. "I don't have a mother." She traced the email. It had been forwarded from Frank to Victoria before reaching her. "Found her," Frank's note to Victoria read. "Homeless woman. perfect for our story. She'll say whatever we want for a few dollars." Sarah's hands shook as she documented everything. Her medication was working, but stress made her symptoms worse. The next morning, 5 board members received an anonymous package. Photos of Sarah supposedly stealing from the diner, statements from witnesses, and a fake background check showing a history of theft. Eleanor called an emergency meeting. "These allegations are serious," the board chairman said. "They're fabricated," Eleanor replied. "Look at the timestamps on the photos. Look at the edits." Victoria smiled. "We should investigate thoroughly, perhaps suspend Sarah during—" "No." Eleanor's voice was firm. "First, we investigate who's behind this harassment." Sarah wasn't invited to the meeting, but she could hear everything through the thin walls. Her computer dinged. Another email. "Meet me at Pine Street Cafe," Frank wrote. "I have proof about your past. Come alone or it goes to the board." Sarah went. She had to know how far they'd go. Frank was waiting. "Victoria says you're causing problems. Time to resign quietly." "Why are you doing this?" "You embarrassed me. Cost me employees who now think they can give handouts. Actions have consequences." "Like abandoning your mother in a nursing home?" Frank froze. "What?" "I found her while researching local facilities. Elizabeth Thompson, admitted 5 years ago, no visitors." "You're lying. She's in the same wing as Margaret Wilson. No one's paid her bills for months. She's being evicted next week." Frank's face went pale. "Victoria didn't mention. Victoria doesn't care about our families. She cares about power." Sarah placed a file on the table. "Your mother needs help. The program I'm developing could help her. That's what you're trying to destroy." Frank opened the file. Photos of his mother. Medical reports. Eviction notices. "I can help her," Sarah said. "Or you can help Victoria destroy everything I'm building. Your choice." Frank's phone buzzed. Victoria calling. He didn't answer. "Why?" he asked. "Why help her after what I did to you?" "Because it's right. Because she deserves better. Because everyone deserves better." She left Frank staring at his mother's file. Outside, her phone lit up with messages from Eleanor. Board meeting canceled. Victoria's emails were traced. Come back to the office. Sarah turned back toward the foundation, her steps steady. The fight wasn't over, but the balance was shifting. Sometimes the best defense was showing your enemies exactly what they were fighting against. Sarah found Margaret's old diary while organizing the foundation's archived documents. It was mixed in with educational records from Foster Haven, dated 15 years ago. Sarah Mitchell, one entry read, "Bright girl, helps others despite having nothing herself. System keeps moving her. I've requested permanent placement, but they refuse to listen." The diary entries continued, documenting Margaret's fight to adopt Sarah. Each rejection from the system was followed by new attempts. "They say I'm too old," Margaret wrote. "Single teacher, approaching retirement, but this child needs stability, someone who sees her worth." Sarah's hands trembled, this time not from her illness. She never knew anyone had tried to keep her. The office door opened. "Victoria." "Those files are restricted," she snapped. "They're about me." "They're foundation property." Victoria reached for the diary. "And your presentation starts in 5 minutes." Sarah hadn't slept in 2 days, preparing for her program proposal. Her new medication dosage wasn't stabilized yet, making everything harder. The boardroom was full. Eleanor sat at the head, looking unusually tired. Victoria smiled from her corner, phone recording everything. "The Cafe with Dignity program," Sarah began, "will partner with local restaurants to—" The room tilted suddenly. Sarah grabbed the podium. "Are you ill?" Victoria asked loudly. "Perhaps we should postpone." "I'm fine." Sarah forced herself to focus. "The program will identify seniors showing early signs of—" Her vision blurred. The presentation slides doubled, then tripled. "Clearly she's not well," Victoria announced. "This unprofessional display—" "Let her finish," Eleanor interrupted, but her voice sounded weak. Sarah pushed through, explaining the program structure. Restaurant staff training, health monitoring, community engagement. Then Margaret walked in. Everyone stared. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was meant to be at her care facility. "I remember," Margaret said clearly. "I remember everything today." Eleanor stood quickly. "Mother, you should be resting." "No." Margaret approached the board. "I need to tell them. About Sarah. About Victoria." Victoria's phone stopped recording. 15 years ago, Margaret continued, Victoria was at Foster Haven too. Administrative assistant. She blocked my adoption request. The room went silent. She falsified reports, Margaret said. Said I was mentally unfit, said Sarah was problematic. I filed complaints, but she had already destroyed the evidence. Victoria stood. Mrs. Wilson, you're confused. Your condition. I'm having a clear day, Margaret cut her off. I remember you shredding my letters to Sarah, telling her I'd abandoned her like everyone else. Sarah's legs gave out. Eleanor rushed to help her, then stumbled herself. Eleanor? Sarah caught her arm. Just dizzy. But Eleanor mumbled, then collapsed. The room erupted in chaos. Someone called 911. Victoria tried to usher Margaret out, but she refused to move. Check her computer, Margaret told the board. Check what she did back then, what she's doing now. Sarah wanted to help, but darkness was closing in. Her medication wasn't working. Nothing was working. She woke up in the hospital again. Eleanor was in the next bed, connected to monitors. Minor stroke, the doctor explained. Both of you need rest. Margaret sat between their beds, her clarity already fading. I'm sorry, she kept saying. I tried to keep you. Victoria was suspended pending investigation. The board found everything, old Foster Haven records, recent conspiracies with Frank, falsified reports. She kept us apart, Sarah realized, all these years. Some people, Eleanor said weakly from her bed, fear what they don't understand. Love, compassion, change. Sarah tried to focus, but her vision was blurring again. The doctor adjusted her IV. Both of you need to step back, he insisted. Your conditions are serious. But there was no stepping back. Not now. The diary had revealed too much. The past and present were colliding, and everyone's health was paying the price. Rest, Margaret said, her moment of clarity passing. Tomorrow is soon enough. But tomorrow would bring more revelations, more challenges. The truth was finally emerging, but at what cost to everyone's health? Sarah closed her eyes, holding Margaret's hand. Some battles couldn't wait for better timing. With Eleanor in the hospital and Sarah on medical leave, Victoria made her move. The board received an emergency proposal: sell the Roberts Foundation to National Care Corporation. Sarah found out through Tom, the janitor. They're packing up files, he reported. Victoria's team is already marking boxes. She wasn't supposed to leave her bed. The infection from her compromised immune system had gotten worse. But Sarah dragged herself to the foundation anyway. Victoria occupied Eleanor's office now. Through the glass, Sarah watched her showing executives around, pointing at departments, making plans. The elderly care division will be restructured, Victoria told them. More efficient, more profitable. Sarah's desk had been cleared, her program proposals gone. The Cafe with Dignity initiative erased from all servers. Her phone buzzed. A message from Frank. Victoria's meeting with nursing home directors. She's canceling Margaret's care contract. Sarah's hands shook as she called Margaret's facility. No answer. She found Margaret in her room, confused and agitated. They say I have to leave. Where's Eleanor? She's still in the hospital. Her stroke. Eleanor had a stroke? Margaret's confusion deepened. I need to grade papers. The children are waiting. Sarah's heart raced. Without foundation support, Margaret would be moved to a state facility. Those places had been detailed in the files Sarah had read. Understaffed, underfunded, devastating for dementia patients. Back at the foundation, Victoria had called a board meeting. Sarah wasn't allowed in, but she could hear through the walls. Eleanor's condition is worse than reported, Victoria announced. The doctors recommend long-term care. The foundation needs new leadership. That's a lie. Sarah tried to tell the board chairman I was just at the hospital. Security escorted her out. Her phone rang. Eleanor's doctor. Her tests show some concerning results. We need next of kin to make decisions. Her daughter's right here, Victoria said suddenly beside Sarah. I have her power of attorney. Sarah stared. Since when? Eleanor signed it last year, in case of emergency. Victoria smiled. I'm her goddaughter, didn't you know? The room spun. Sarah's fever was getting worse. Go home, Victoria ordered. You're not employed here anymore. Budget cuts. Sarah stumbled to her car. Her phone kept buzzing. Frank sending documents, Tom reporting Victoria's movements, Margaret's facility requesting payment. At the hospital, Eleanor was barely conscious. The stroke had affected her worse than they'd thought. The foundation, Eleanor whispered. Don't let her. Victoria has power of attorney, Sarah said. She's selling everything to National Care. Eleanor's monitors beeped faster. No, the letter. Save your strength, the nurse interrupted, ushering Sarah out. In the hallway, Sarah's phone lit up. An email from the board. Victoria's sale proposal had been approved. The transition would begin immediately. Margaret's social worker called next. State placement is all we can offer now. The foundation's support is being withdrawn. Sarah drove to the foundation again, barely able to focus. Security stopped her at the door. New policy, the guard said. No unauthorized visitors. Through the windows, she watched Victoria leading another tour. National care executives nodded approvingly at everything. Her phone buzzed one last time. A text from Tom, found something in Eleanor's old files, hidden safe in the wall. Come tonight. Sarah's vision blurred. The infection was getting worse. She needed rest, medication, time. But there was no time. Margaret would be moved tomorrow. The sale would be finalized next week. Eleanor wasn't improving. Everything they'd built was about to disappear. Sarah steadied herself against her car. One more night. One last chance to find whatever was in that safe. She just had to stay conscious long enough to save what Eleanor had spent her life building, even if it killed her. The hidden safe contained one document, Eleanor's real power of attorney, signed 3 days before her stroke. It named Sarah, not Victoria, as her legal representative. Call an emergency board meeting, Sarah told the chairman. Tomorrow morning. You're not authorized. Check the document's registration number. It's real. Victoria arrived at the meeting flanked by national care executives. She froze when she saw Sarah at Eleanor's usual place. This is irregular, Victoria started. So is falsifying power of attorney, Sarah replied. Her fever burned, but she kept her voice steady. The board needs to hear the truth. The room filled quickly. Frank arrived last, carrying a box of files. Before we begin, Victoria announced, Miss Mitchell is clearly ill. She's not in any condition. Let her speak, the chairman interrupted. Sarah stood, gripping the table for support. The Roberts Foundation was built to protect people like Margaret Wilson, like Elizabeth Thompson, like thousands of seniors who have nowhere else to turn. She opened Frank's box. These are Victoria's real plans for after the sale. Every current care recipient terminated, every program replaced with profit-driven alternatives. Victoria lunged for the files. Those are confidential. Like the files you destroyed at Foster Haven? Sarah pushed a button and Margaret appeared on the video screen, her recorded testimony from her lucid day playing clearly. National Care has an excellent reputation, Victoria argued. Their profit margins. Show them, Frank said quietly. Show them what happened to my mother. Sarah projected photos of Elizabeth Thompson's case. This is Victoria's model facility, where she sent Frank's mother, where she plans to send all our residents. The national care executives shifted uncomfortably. The Cafe with Dignity program costs less than Victoria's salary, Sarah continued. It could save thousands. Instead, she'd rather sell everything Eleanor built to cover her own fraud. Her vision blurred. The infection was winning. Sarah? Frank stepped forward as she swayed. I'm not finished. She straightened. Eleanor trusted me with her legacy because she knows what it's like to watch someone you love fade away. To fight a system that sees profits instead of people. Victoria laughed. Touching speech. But business is business. The sale is already illegal, the foundation's lawyer interrupted, holding up Eleanor's real power of attorney. This voids everything you've signed. Sarah's legs buckled. Frank caught her before she fell. The board needs to vote, Victoria insisted. My proposal. Check your email, Frank said. My resignation from 20 minutes ago includes everything you told me about your plans, the real ones. The chairman stood. Miss Chen, please escort our national care guests out, then clear out your office. Sarah barely heard Victoria's protests. The room was spinning. Call an ambulance, someone said. Wait, she gasped. The vote, the program. Through darkening vision, she saw hands raise, heard yes votes. Then Eleanor's voice from the doorway. I told you she'd save it. Sarah turned. Eleanor sat in a wheelchair, pale but alert. Margaret stood beside her, having another clear moment. How? Victoria demanded. My stroke was minor, Eleanor said. The complications were exaggerated. By you. You knew? Sarah asked. I needed proof of how far she'd go, Eleanor replied. You gave us everything we needed. Victoria ran from the room as security approached. Sarah tried to smile, but her body finally gave out. The last thing she saw was Frank calling 911, Margaret holding her hand, and Eleanor directing the board to continue voting. She woke up 3 days later in intensive care. The infection had nearly killed her. Eleanor sat beside her bed, reading board minutes. The program passed unanimously, Frank's helping implement it. Victoria? Arrested this morning. The foster haven records were enough. Sarah closed her eyes. I still don't understand. Why trust me with everything? Because 15 years ago, my mother tried to save a little girl who kept helping others, even when she had nothing. Eleanor said, Today that girl saved everything we built. The monitors beeped steadily as Sarah drifted off again, this time toward recovery instead of collapse. Sometimes, the greatest victories come just when everything seems lost. Recovery took 6 weeks. Sarah worked from her hospital bed, coordinating with Frank to launch the Cafe with Dignity program. 5 restaurants signed up yesterday, Frank reported during his daily visit. They all want staff training on recognizing early dementia signs. Sarah reviewed the list on her laptop. The Sunrise Diner was among them, under new management. Mom's doing better at the Foundation's facility, Frank added. She remembers things now, asks about you. The Foundation had changed during Sarah's absence. Eleanor reorganized the board, promoting people who shared their vision. Victoria's arrest made headlines, bringing attention to elderly care issues. The governor's office called, Eleanor said, bringing Sarah's medication. They want to implement our program statewide. Sarah's health improved with proper treatment. The Foundation's insurance covered everything, including experimental therapies that finally stabilized her condition. She attended her first post-recovery board meeting by video call. The Cafe with Dignity presentation showed impressive numbers. 30 participating restaurants, hundreds of seniors identified for early intervention, dozens of crisis cases prevented. We need to expand, the chairman said. Other states are asking about the program. Frank led the expansion team. His experience as a restaurant manager proved invaluable for training staff. His mother's story convinced skeptical owners. National Care called, Eleanor mentioned during Sarah's final week in the hospital. They want to partner with us, instead of competing. Their board fired everyone involved in Victoria's scheme. Sarah's discharge day coincided with her first public speech about the program. She insisted on delivering it in person. The conference room was packed. Healthcare providers, restaurant owners, and government officials filled every seat. Reporters lined the walls. 6 months ago, I was a waitress who lost everything for buying breakfast for a confused senior, Sarah began. Today, that simple act has evolved into a program that's changing lives. Eleanor watched from the front row, smiling as Sarah presented the results. Margaret sat beside her, having one of her increasingly frequent clear days. Prevention costs less than crisis care, Sarah explained. Both financially and emotionally, our program proves that. The questions lasted 2 hours. Sarah's voice stayed strong, her hands steady. The new medication worked better than she'd ever hoped. Back at the Foundation, Frank waited with news. The state approved our training certification. Restaurant staff who complete our program get official credentials now. Sarah's old desk had been replaced with a real office. Director of Community Programs, the door read. We need to talk about the future, Eleanor said that evening. The Foundation needs a succession plan. I'm not qualified. You built a revolutionary program from a single act of kindness, Eleanor interrupted. You're more qualified than anyone. The next board meeting focused on expansion. Sarah presented Phase 2 of her program, community centers where seniors could gather, connecting restaurants with social services. The first center opens next month, she announced, at the old Sunrise Diner location. Frank helped design the layout, incorporating lessons from his mother's care experience. His dedication to the program had surprised everyone, including himself. Victoria's trial starts next week, Eleanor mentioned. They found more falsified records from foster haven. Dozens of affected families. Sarah nodded, focused on her work. The past mattered less than the future they were building. Her phone buzzed constantly now, calls from other cities wanting to implement the program, journalists requesting interviews, medical researchers studying their prevention model. I never thanked you, Frank said, bringing coffee to her office, for showing me the truth about Mom. About everything. Sarah looked at the photos on her wall. Margaret teaching again at a senior center, Eleanor cutting ribbons at program launches, Frank training restaurant staff. "Sometimes we need someone to show us who we really are," she replied. Eleanor appeared in the doorway. "Ready for tomorrow's presentation to the National Healthcare Board?" Sarah gathered her files, her movements confident and healthy. Ready. The foundation had transformed, but so had she. From waitress to director, from survivor to leader. Sometimes the greatest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. The grand opening of the Wilson Thompson Community Center happened 1 year after Sarah's fateful decision at the Sunrise Diner. The renovated building maintained its diner counter, now serving as a gathering space for seniors and volunteers. "We've come full circle," Eleanor said, watching the crowd gather for the opening ceremony. Sarah checked the final preparations. Every detail reflected their journey. The training kitchen, where restaurant staff learned to recognize signs of dementia, the social services office where families got immediate help, the community dining room where no senior ate alone. Margaret arrived early, having her clearest day in months. "My classroom," she said, walking into the education space where she'd teach again, just like at Foster Haven. The press arrived next, followed by city officials and healthcare representatives. The program's success had exceeded every projection. "Time for the announcement," Eleanor whispered to Sarah. Sarah took the podium, her health stable and strong. 1 year ago, a cup of coffee changed everything. Today, the Cafe with Dignity program operates in 50 cities, but this center represents something more. She gestured to Frank, who helped his mother Elizabeth onto the stage. "This is what happens when we choose compassion over convenience, community over profit." Elizabeth Thompson, now fully recovered thanks to proper care, spoke clearly. "My son found me because someone cared enough to look." Frank stood beside her, transformed from the angry manager who'd fired Sarah into one of the program's strongest advocates. "The board has approved our nationwide expansion," Sarah continued. "But more importantly, they've approved something else." Eleanor joined her at the podium. "After 20 years leading the Roberts Foundation, it's time for transition. Sarah Mitchell will be our new executive director." The audience applauded. Margaret beamed from her seat, fully present for this moment. "But that's not all," Sarah added. "The Wilson Thompson Center is the first of 50 will open nationwide, each one combining direct services with our restaurant partnership program." She unveiled the center's mission statement: every senior seen, every story heard, every life valued. Victoria's conviction had made national news the week before. The evidence from Foster Haven had exposed decades of elder care fraud. The publicity helped pass new protection laws. After the ceremony, Sarah found quiet moment at the old diner counter. Frank served coffee, just like old times, but everything different. "Remember when you fired me?" Sarah asked. "Remember when you saved my mother?" he countered. Eleanor joined them, helping Margaret into a seat. "Tell them," she urged her mother. Margaret smiled, reaching for Sarah's hand. "I kept your essays. Everyone, from 3rd grade. I knew you'd change lives someday." Sarah poured coffee for 4. The same gesture that had cost her everything now represented everything they'd built. "The governor signed the Dignity Act today," Eleanor announced. "Every state-funded facility must implement our protection programs." Outside, more guests arrived for the community dinner. Seniors, families, restaurant workers in training, the community they'd created growing stronger each day. "National Care called again," Frank said. "They want to convert all their facilities to our model." Sarah watched a volunteer help a confused senior find his seat. Another served coffee to someone sitting alone. Small acts multiplying into lasting change. "Next week we start training in Chicago," she said. "Then Atlanta." Margaret touched her arm. "You did good, Sarah. We all did good." Eleanor raised her coffee cup. "To second chances and 3rd grade essays." Sarah looked around the center, at Frank training new volunteers, at Elizabeth helping another senior navigate services, at Margaret preparing to teach again. The foundation had evolved beyond anything they'd imagined, but its heart remained the same. One person seeing another's need and choosing to help. "To coffee," Sarah said, raising her cup, "and kindness." Outside, a confused senior approached the center's door. Sarah watched a volunteer greet them, offer help, show them in. The cycle continued. just as it would tomorrow and the day after. Some endings were really beginnings in disguise. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that remind us how one small act of kindness can change the world. Share in the comments your own experiences with helping others, or tell us about someone who made a difference in your life. Remember, every cup of coffee can be the beginning of a revolution, and every person has the power to transform someone's darkest day into a new dawn of hope.